Dr. Jaishankar, let me pose this question that he's asked for you, actually. He's asked to you. Can India take a stand? You've been a diplomat for this country for so long. Do you think we have it in us to take this kind of a stand? Choose sides?
Well, I think we should take a stand, and I think we should choose a side, and that's our side.
What about the American fight back, sir, in your assessment? Do you see this as an individual-led American position, sitting as a, as a foreign policy viewer? In your assessment, is this more individual-led, or do you think there is something more systemic? I'm going to pose the same question to General Patriots, but as an observer, do you think there is something texturally different about what is happening between US and China today, or are we just seeing very loud negotiations taking place, basically about economic interests?
Well, I think on the United States, it would depend on the issue. Clearly, on a lot of issues, there are sharp individualistic positions, usually at 4 o'clock in the morning through a tweet. But I think on China, my sense is that the deep state and the loud state are united, that there is a broader consensus about how to deal with China. That's certainly the impression I have.
Is the American fight back going to be sustainable?
In the short answer, yes. But first of all, let me just tell you, Samira, it's a pleasure to be back on stage, especially with my old comrade, Foreign Secretary Jaishankar, and with one of Europe's great leaders for a good period of time, Prime Minister Gentiloni. And congratulations to you and your team for putting together what is increasingly a must-attend conference. Look, let me first actually just offer as a general comment that when one looks at the United States, keep in mind, by the way, I am not a registered voter. I am not part of any party. I am not just bipartisan. I am nonpartisan. So I'm not here speaking on behalf of the administration or anything like that. But what I would caution individuals around the world is certainly you should read the tweets. They are the unfiltered, unedited expressions of the thought of the commander-in-chief of the still world's greatest superpower. But then follow the troops, follow the money, and follow the actual policy. And as the Prime Minister and I were discussing backstage, the U.S. is actually doing more for NATO. Certainly it's also criticizing more vehemently, if you will, the lack of adequate defense spending on NATO, but as the Prime Minister noted, this is not the first president to do that. I was a NATO officer, if you will, as a 1-star, 3-star, 4-star, while also being U.S. roles in those positions. And I saw successive presidencies, 3 actually, criticize, again, the lack. When the U.S. is spending more than double all of the other NATO countries put together on defense, there is an issue. And it is one that this president has been more vocal on, certainly, and has employed, if you will, harsher rhetoric. But at the same time, when you look at what we are doing, not just continuing the previous administration's plans for troops in the Baltic states, aircraft in Eastern Europe, an armored brigade of the United States returned to the European continent for the first time in a number of years, since the last of those tanks were withdrawn, new NATO command structures being approved, all of this, frankly, in a response. Let's keep in mind, if you will, that Vladimir Putin is the greatest gift to NATO since the end of the Cold War. And it has provided a new reason for living, if you will, for NATO. And indeed, the U.S. is continuing to be, I think, the backbone in many respects of the force, not just there, but in other places around the world. But when you talk about what is the single biggest development, I think Foreign Secretary's predictions last year have absolutely proven out, especially when it comes to the case of U.S. and China. And here I would point out that the U.S., this is again not just Donald Trump. This is a bipartisan view that has gradually solidified over the course of a number of years. You started with a U.S. view that if we welcome China into the WTO, into global trading, if we extend a hand, if we allow them to protect some of their industries through definitions that no longer quite apply, et cetera, if we raise concerns about theft of intellectual property, IP forced transfer, protections, the Great Firewall of China that excludes 3 of the great technology firms and others of the world. Over time, China inevitably, as it becomes more wealthy, will become more open, more transparent, more, if you will, supportive of the values that I think those on the stage here and many in the audience treasure, and frankly, more like us. And unfortunately, that has not come to bear in all cases. This is not a criticism of that. This is a different system, and we are now seeing that. But what has happened is there's a bipartisan resolve in the United States now that something does have to be done.
Dr. Jaishankar, let me pose this question that he's asked for you, actually. He's asked to you. Can India take a stand? You've been a diplomat for this country for so long. Do you think we have it in us to take this kind of a stand? Choose sides?
Well, I think we should take a stand, and I think we should choose a side, and that's our side. And I'll tell you the reason.
India first.
Oh, absolutely. Why not? Say, look.
As all countries do, after all. I mean,
if you look at some issues, say trade issues, trade deficit, market access, non-market economics, connectivity. I think these are issues where actually a lot of our concerns are shared by the US and Europe as well. But at the same time, today what the US is doing to the WTO, which really, I mean, short of gutting it, I mean, they really put it under intense pressure. That's the developing divide which has historically been there, erasing that or diluting that. So I think part of our problem with the US today is the ability to distinguish between the baby and the bathwater. So you can't, solve the problem by chucking both out. I think this is the... So the larger answer to your question would be, there will be a lot of areas where our interests would converge with those of the US and Europe. There will be areas where they won't, or they will be partial. And to my mind, if you look at it, east of India, there seems to be more convergence. But west of India, there seems to be less. And a lot of our concerns about AFPAC are still coming out of a belief that what the US specifically and Europe in addition, their thinking, their assessment of that situation is significantly different from ours.
Prime Minister, if the Cold War that General Petraeus has warned us about in his last intervention was to come about, which side of that divide would you think Europe would opt for?
Well, I think Europe should be, first of all, against a dynamic of a new Cold War. I think we have nothing to win and a lot to lose in a dynamic of a new Cold War.
Let me ask you, Russia, and if you were to now make the similar predictions for the next year when you are speaking with us again, and I question you on those, what would those be? So Russia and the next changes that 2019 could see as something that we would all have to contend with.
Well, to be very honest, if there's one thing which baffles me about American thinking currently, and to some extent European thinking, it is the obsession with Russia. I think it's so emotional, it's so visceral.
Like India with Pakistan?
In a way, most. No,
I'm sorry, I'm just putting it.
We haven't yet passed laws of sanctions against Pakistan.
Okay.
So, and I'll tell you why. Look, I mean, it's interesting you make that comparison, because in our own part of the world, we get advice from other people saying, be practical, be rational, you can't not talk to the other guy. Okay, they may be doing bad things, but you got to live with it. You got to get them into the tent. Now, for people who give you all this advice in running our lives,
and like ourselves when it comes to
absolutely. So I'm honestly, the extremes to which this has gone, and I'm not sure it's even smart, because I think it's actually giving Russia less and less incentives.
To be a stable actor.
No, I mean, obviously then Russia will be angular to assert itself, make its point. So I think this is an issue on which, I mean, it's not an ideological issue, at least for us. But I think we have a very clear sort of difference in perspective with the Western world broadly here. Your answer, where would we be a year, where would we start? I think about the only thing I could say safely, I hope, 2019 is going to be a much bumpier year than 2018. I think you're going to have, particularly US, China, look, the Chinese have come such a long way and so successfully. They're not going to give up on a model which in their minds has worked for them, and the United States today and Europe to some degree finds its very core interests under pressure. So I see sort of elements of irreconcilability here. Now, but in real life, even the irreconcilable is temporarily reconciled. So I think you're going to have truces, you're going to have partial agreements, you're going to have a kind of a ceasefire of various kinds, but it will remain very frictional and very bumpy, and I'm not sure that's going to be good for the world, but it's going to be the reality.